So, the George Floyd murder, let's be clear, was heinous. It was gross, it was brutal, and it was unacceptable. The four policemen involved should have been and were fired, charged, and one charged with murder. They deserve to have the book thrown at them, in my opinion. They deserve the full punishment prescribed by law. They're bad cops, dirty cops, maybe racist cops, but certainly cops with no respect for human life. This murder was senseless, avoidable, and antithetical to the high standard to which we duly hold our elected, or our law enforcement, not elected, but are the ones that take the oath to protect and serve us. This killing is worthy of protest. I agree that protests are warranted for this kind of murder, for this specific case. Peaceful protests against police brutality, especially a specific instance like this one, are warranted. In fact, later in the broadcast today, we're going to hear from Martin Luther King Jr., and he very much felt that one of the places where we needed work as a society was police brutality, and he thought that for black men as well as white men, as well as any other constituent of the United States. So, remember, we read the First Amendment to our Constitution, and it says the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. There have been hundreds, maybe thousands of peaceful protests across our country and the world in solidarity with George Floyd, and I support the peaceful protests. What I don't and will never support are violent riots, looting, murder, cop killing, burning buildings, and hijacking a legitimate, peaceful movement for police reform and turning it into anarchy and violence for political gain. Do you know the word for an unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims? You know what that's called in the dictionary? That's the dictionary definition of terrorism. These terrorists are burning down black-owned businesses. How does that help the cause of advancing race relations in the United States? These terrorists are looting Nike stores. Nike, the woke company that hired Colin Kaepernick, and they used the cause that he knelt for, police brutality, to steal the latest Jordans. How does this make any sense? How does that help bring awareness to police brutality? These terrorist thugs are cleaning out Target, stealing TVs and busting down windows in low-income areas where the next day families come out to feed their families, to go to the grocery store. And they see this grocery store where they go to buy necessities to live and to feed their families, their Target boarded up or on fire. How does this help the least fortunate in these communities, in these densely populated urban communities? Don't their Black Lives matter? How can you claim Black Lives Matter and then destroy the communities around them? In New York City, more black children are murdered in the womb or are aborted each year than are born. Does anyone care about those black lives? What about the black lives that never get the chance to exist? Is anyone marching in the street over their murders? And when they do march into the streets, does the media cover it? No. What about the countless black lives ruined by incarceration? Not because they were there unjustly, no, but because we failed as a society to encourage two-parent households and instead incentivized single motherhood, depriving generations of men, and disproportionately black men, the overwhelmingly positive experience of having a father in the home. Don't their black lives matter? Not to these terrorists. To these terrorists, black lives are just a means to their destructive ends. Let's take a minute and differentiate between individual racists and systemic racism. First, on individual racists, they exist. There are racists out there. People can be racist, and some of them are. They're stupid. They're ignorant, or they are both. Judging someone based on the amount of melanin in their skin is the highest form of foolishness. It makes absolutely no sense. An open exchange of ideas, especially controversial ideas, and real accountability for individual acts of racism would begin the healing process for individuals and for a country as a whole. With that as an operating standard, we can move forward in gradually expelling the foundations for racism at home, which is where all of this starts. Teaching our children that all people are valuable and equal in the sight of God, and should be in the sight of other human beings. That said, individual law enforcement officers must be held to the highest reasonable standard when serving and protecting the civilians in their care. The highest possible standard. Negligent, ignorant, racist, bad cops need to be held to full account for their actions as an example to any public servant who might have motives against minorities or any motives other than public service. So that's individual racists. Every individual racist, especially those who act on it, should be held to account and their ideas should be challenged. But now let's talk about systemic racism. Systemic racism is more ambiguous, and it's being used as a hot button issue to instigate these riots and violence that we're seeing currently. Systemic racism implies that the legislative and judicial systems are set up to intentionally disadvantage minorities. This was blatantly the case before the Civil Rights Movement and during the Jim Crow law era into the 1950s. That said, today in 2020, there aren't any laws that I see in our system that target minorities, and if they exist, I will be the first person to stand with the minorities and say we need a change in the laws in favor of racial equality. But again, we need to identify the actual laws that discriminate in order to rectify them. If we just blame all inequality on this amorphous idea of systemic racism and never address the actual inequalities, then we are just fanning the racially divisive flames. Again, show me the racists and the racist laws, and we will go fight for equality together, with everybody that I know for that matter. But don't use these legitimate complaints as your excuse to incite violence and riots. It's not productive. It only moves the conversation from a place of empathy and understanding to a place of resentment. Everybody agreed, that I heard from anyway, from the mainstream media all the way on down, everybody agreed that this George Floyd murder was heinous. We were all on board. We were all on board to get police brutality out in the open and to have racial equality in our police enforcement and our law enforcement system. But this rioting destroyed that. You know, we were at a place where things were getting better. If anything, our post-Jim Crow laws leaned towards rectifying past injustices by granting advantages of affirmative action hiring and higher education admittance curves, neither of which actually helped the minority community, but that's a conversation for a different time. So in wrapping up this conversation about George Floyd, we all agreed that it was heinous. We all agreed it was bad. White, black, and everything in between, we all agreed that this warranted people in the streets. However, as soon as you took it from being about George Floyd and being about police brutality and turned it into a violent movement, you discredited the movement. So if you want your movement to be legitimate, the first thing you need to do is keep it peaceful, as we will hear later from Martin Luther King Jr. So, hi, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this clip, please go and check out the full show on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Please share, like, and subscribe. See you next time.